Zeke, why don't you tell us something about yourself, and especially also what do you expect from this webinar?
Super. Thanks very much, Maurice. Lovely to be here, and nice to see everyone joining the webinar today. As you mentioned, I've been Chief Compliance Officer at Volvo Group and also at Yara International, a large chemicals company based out of Oslo in Norway. But I started out as a lawyer and as a forensic accountant. So I was with PwC, KPMG. I worked on the House of Commons expenses scandal. I worked on Lehman Brothers after they went into administration. So lots and lots of different investigations work. And now I'm the founder of North Star, and we help with anything to do with creativity and intelligence in ethics and compliance. So what that means is we do program design, we do investigations, we do due diligence, unit if it's compliance, we help.
Well, that sounds great. So why don't we kick off with a question for our viewers, Paul? So we start with, which type of legislation do you find most challenging to keep up with? Is it international law? Is it national law across your countries and your operations? Is it industry-specific regulations and standards? Or are all areas equally challenging? So Zeke, what do you think?
Well, you can see how they're all intertwined, right? And I'm not going to lead our viewers as they continue answering the poll, and we're seeing those coming in now, which is interesting to see. For a long time, the international law has been developing, and then you see that transposed into national law. But of course, each company has its own challenges going into industry regulations and specific standards. So a huge amount of complexity for companies as they develop and go over time. We're just looking at the results here now. And
that's interesting, right? It's quite dispatched, I would say.
Yeah, very much so. But we see that the biggest individual response so far is in national legislation, and that roughly matches my expectation. I think the international law is a bit softer. It's a little bit more developed over time, and we're seeing the national laws catch up at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I do expect that industry-specific regulations will increase maybe over the coming years with new technologies like AI popping up.
Exactly.
That might be more interesting over the years.
Exactly. And I think what you've also seen is non-regulated companies getting regulated. Over time, standards have been placed on manufacturing firms and industrials in a way that they weren't necessarily used to before. So that's an interesting trend over the past 10, 15 years.
Yeah. So, Zeke, it would be great to share a bit more about the latest legislation affecting compliance teams and also their efforts. So why don't we start with the European Whistleblower Directive? Everybody is talking about this directive for a long time now, but maybe you can remind us a little bit about how the legislation has been evolving since 2019.
Yeah, as you say, it's a piece of 2019 legislation, the EU Whistleblowing Directive, and the clues in the title. It is a directive, which means that at the EU level, there's an end goal set, and it's for the national legislatures to transpose that into national law and develop the ways of working. It's not been entirely smooth, as you can see from some of the commentary online and over the past few years. It's not all been plain sailing. I think what's been forgotten actually about the EU Whistleblowing Directive is that it relates to breaches of union law in the work-related context. That's a really important fact. But also that its big focus, correctly, in my view, is on non-retaliation. So there's been a huge focus on where people can report and where they can get protections from the enforcement authorities.
Yeah, and so when we zoom in a little bit on these compliance teams and also HR teams, legal teams, they need to act, right? When we talk about the Whistleblower Directive. What clauses drives most complexities and discussions around those teams?
Yeah, so I think the response to national legislation, as we just saw in the poll there, the international stuff is a little bit more straightforward for the majority of companies, but the national legislation is what can really cause some headaches for compliance teams and others working with compliance topics. Responding to a patchwork of national legislation is what causes, in my view, the biggest headache. And in the EU Whistleblowing Directive, that was particularly the case with sharing resources. I don't think that aspect went particularly smoothly at all.
And was the sharing resource discussion, was that based on the fact that cases should be handled locally?
So what it was that as the national legislatures started to implement their national legislation related to the whistleblowing directive, Sweden and Denmark went first, and they said, hey, it makes most sense to set this up as centralized reporting in for example, a group of companies, and that all of the entities within that group can share that reporting channel, share the investigation process, and all of the resources that go with it. Pretty quickly, that became problematic. So there were 2 letters issued by the Commission, the EU Commission, in 2021, and those letters made it very, very clear that the Commission expected local reporting channels to be in place, especially for the medium-sized entities, around 250 employees or more. And I have to say, for a lot of compliance people working with this topic day in, day out, that was a surprise. The Commission came with its view to say, we believe as a Commission that there are too few reports being made in general in the EU. And that's for 2 reasons. That's because there's a lack of knowledge of the reporting channels, and there's a lack of availability at the local level to deal with problems. But I think anyone working with compliance day to day also knows that there's a huge reluctance to report locally. You work with these people, and maybe they're the source of the problem very frequently. So having an anonymized and centralized channel was really a safe passage for a lot of reporters. That was a source of great friction when the EU whistleblowing directive came into national law.
And maybe if we zoom a little bit on your practice as advisor as well, to those, let's say, chief compliance officers or legal general counsels who need to come up with a solution. Obviously, this is a regulation that is attached to compliancy and integrity. Can you say that it is a bad idea to keep and run your system purely centrally instead of doing it also locally?
Yeah, I think that's been made absolutely clear by the Commission that they want local reporting channels, especially if an entity has 250 employees or more. They want the investigation resources there, especially if the reporter wants that investigation to be handled locally. That said, the Commission has made it clear that you can also set up your central channels and maintain oversight over different reports there. So there's this parallel system emerging between the local entities and the central resources. Whenever we hear the word parallel, you're starting to think about efficiency. Does this actually work well? Is it hand in glove between the local entity and the central channel? Is it consistent? Are we looking after our legal obligations when we handle things locally? So still lots of problems for compliance teams there.
Yeah, and if we, let's say, enter discussion with regard to the whistleblower directive when it comes to local handling of cases and central oversight, what is a tip you can provide the compliance teams with?
Yeah, I think you've just got to get that set up right across the member states. There are probably some efficiencies that you can drive in terms of how you word things, how you make the channels available to people, especially the wording on the actual website where people might go to report. And then building capacity and competence within the local entities, particularly with where there are local resources like HR or audit team members, just help them to build that capacity.
Yeah. And so I see also a lot of local teams struggling when you look simply at the budget, that if you now suddenly have to set up a person that is able to investigate a case, would you then say, okay, please line up a sort of emergency person that you can bring in when that's how shit hits the fan, because that's obviously with whistleblowing sometimes the case.
Yeah, I think having something in your pocket, a process or a team who can be on the ground pretty quickly, who knows the relevant legislation and can respond appropriately to a whistleblowing report, that remains as important as it was before.
Yeah, I think that's also what I discussed with with some compliance teams, that they have this sort of emergency team that they can really set up quickly and respond to a case. So thank you for sharing this. So I think let's zoom in a little bit more on other legislations. So what other, let's say, relevant legislation should compliance and audit teams be on top of?
yeah, I think supply chain is a very important topic at the moment, and it's increasingly being formalized in terms of the legislation that we see. However, there's lots coming across the desk at the moment. You see the Federal Trade Commission on non-competes. You see the increase of the use of failure to prevent. That famous concept that came out in the UK Bribery Act is being expanded to include things like fraud. So lots going on and a real challenge to keep up.
Yeah, thank you. And we will zoom in a little bit more on this CS triple B, which you're going to explain later. So also a more question for me to the audience. Please feel free to ask a question. And you can do so by going to the chat button on top right of the screen. You can post your questions in the chat, and we will administer them and come back to those questions at the end of the webinar. So Zeke, now we zoom in a little bit more on supply chains, because supply chains are of great importance for companies. And they're also extremely difficult because if you ask, let's say, a head of compliance or a head of audit, say, can you maybe explain to me what is your supply chain? That is even an extremely difficult question. And now we have a law coming up, or actually there is a law that is going to come up with strict obligations in that field. Can you help us a little bit understand this new regulation?
Yes, and to your point, supply chains can be extremely complex. They can be not only tens of thousands of direct suppliers, but hundreds of thousands of indirect. So we've really got to get this right. The Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive is quite a mouthful, so we're going to stick to CS3D during today's discussion. And it's been adopted just a few days ago. So what's running now is the clock on this national transposition. And it's no coincidence that we've just talked about the EU Whistleblowing Directive and the national transposition there. We've got this 2-year period where national legislatures will implement their legislation related to the CS3D. And I think there's an opportunity here for compliance professionals to make sure that their voice is heard on what this means for their companies and how this is best set up and best approached by the national legislatures. In brief, there's going to be a 3-year phase-in period. It applies to very large companies, and there are only about 5,000 companies in total who will be affected by this legislation. Ultimately, if you've got more than 1,000 employees and more than 450 million euros globally in revenue, then this is going to apply. If you're a non-European company, if you generate more than 450 million euros in the EU territory, then the legislation will apply to you. Okay. But it's all about business partners. It's all about chains of activities. We're going to get a little bit into how far we need to go in tackling this legislation. But you could be in a position where you need to identify not only your direct business partners, but also your indirect business partners. You're going to need to do due diligence in terms of making sure that your policies and your risk management are in order, but also that your risk assessments and your identification of risks in the chain of activities are all in order. And then there are some other responsibilities around climate change and transition plans. We are expecting guidance from the Commission in late 2026, maybe early 2027. Let's see how that goes. And that is going to be the most crucial bit of approaching this legislation.
Okay, thank you. It's quite a mouthful. And one of the things that remind me while reading through the articles of this directive is the fact that actually there are quite big fines, right, to be potentially enforced in the future. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that briefly?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of enforcement, there are potentially fines at 5% of revenue globally. But there's also civil liability, and I think that's an interesting part where affected parties can bring a claim directly against an individual company or group of companies. So let's see how that plays out. Again, the Commission guidance is going to be critically important there. But in terms of enforcement, the final draft of the text is a vast improvement on what it was a few years ago, where all of these topics were a bit muddied. And I think through the parliamentary process, it's been much improved.
Wow, that's great to hear. And so I want to zoom in a little bit more on the discussion we had with the whistleblower directive, was the local reporting versus sharing of resources.
Yep.
Did the legislative authorities learn from that discussion, and do they have improved it here?
Well, we can't get inside their minds. However, we can read what's in black and white on the paper. And it appears that sharing of resources within groups of companies has really been taken care of. It's explicitly mentioned several times. Not only that, but also industry-wide and stakeholder, sort of cross-stakeholder efforts are encouraged. So what we can presume is that companies are going to be able to share information between themselves within a group, and then where relevant and appropriate, they can share information across an industry or across a stakeholder group. I think that's going to be really, really helpful for the implementation. Notification mechanisms, complaint mechanisms are also referenced, and I would expect there to be some guidance from the Commission on how this interplays with the EU whistleblowing directive, because there's clearly a link there. So waiting on guidance on that topic, but really glad to see that the final text took in these learnings and hopefully is implemented in the right way.
Yeah, so the CSDDD also sounds if sustainability teams need to worry about it. Why is it also, apart from those sustainability teams, important for a chief compliance officer or a compliance team to worry about it?
Yeah, the scope of risks is focused on human rights and environmental risks, and it's somewhat disappointing that we got governance dropped from this text, especially anti-corruption efforts. Anti-corruption is specifically mentioned in the preamble to the legislation, so a very nice hint that it's relevant, and it's described as being intertwined with human rights and environmental risks. Nonetheless, disappointing to see that dropped. So this is really a piece of legislation that's a focus for sustainability teams, but compliance teams are often the ones running the due diligence system. And so you're going to have those sustainability teams relying on a key compliance process. I think the advice in terms of how to run the due diligence, where do you get your information from, what's reliable, what's trustworthy, etc., how far do we go? All of those things are topics that compliance teams have worked on for many, many years. So you can really help sustainability colleagues with getting this right. And ultimately, it's a board level discussion. I think chief compliance officers, general counsels, heads of audit should all want to be deeply involved in that discussion.
Yeah, and when we take a more pragmatic approach, I think identifying in a ordered and structured way who are your suppliers. I think that kind of exercise, is this something that in the light of this upcoming law and national adaptation is becoming more of a topic to maybe revise again as a company? And probably, I think every day you should be active with your supply chain. But do you think having a strong overview and insight in those supply chains is crucial here?
Yeah, it's crucial, and it's really, really hard. So if we just talk about a simple, relatively simple multinational company, you might have different ERPs, different instances of the same ERP. You might have some entities who are not within that ERP. So you've also got your joint ventures and your other holdings. Your supply chain is more complex than probably even you realize. So structure is the name of the game. I think, first of all, describing your own business and your own chains of activities with the language of the CS3D is going to be a critical part. So to say, this is what we do, and these are our chains of activities in the simplest possible terms. And I challenge you to write down what your business does on a single piece of paper. And then to match those chains of activities, those business processes and activities to the human rights risks and the environmental risks, which takes some judgment. Then add in the complex factors of different entities, joint ventures, different countries in which we operate, and the differing levels of risk, and then the fact that risk changes over time. I think you've got a real challenge on your hands, and you're going to have to be structured.
Yeah, that's. I think, and then also what I've learned is when I talk to general counsels, sometimes I did an exercise with somebody, say, can you provide me with sort of legal mapping on what kind of regulations are important for you as a, let's say, as a business? And I think even in 2024, with more and more regulations coming up, it's extremely difficult to have a complete insight on what regulations are affecting your business. Can you provide maybe also teams with a tip there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should also address some of the viewers' questions on that exact topic.
Yeah.
Things like, what do smaller companies do? The impact of this on larger companies is clear, but if you imagine that a larger company largely is going to impose this legislation onto smaller and medium-sized suppliers in their chain of activities, by default, this applies not just to those 5,000 companies that I mentioned, but a huge number of SMEs. Those SMEs are going to have to prepare, if they're in a kind of a low-risk jurisdiction or a low-risk activity, they're going to have to prepare for some deal of contract clauses and some renegotiation or renewal of the contracts that you've got with larger companies. But also, if you're in a medium or high-risk set of activities, you might need to then be very, very open with your customer about who's in your supply chain and what activities you've got as a company to make sure that your activities are in line with the legislation. But you're absolutely right. You know, the challenges of the CS3D, the biggest complexity and the thing that companies are going to find hardest is all about this chain of activities. How far do we go? Where are the real risks? And we must avoid this becoming basically a paper exercise. It's all very nice having an Excel spreadsheet, but there have got to be real implications in the operations. And that's where the real day-to-day monitoring is done, right? If you remember with your sanctions risks, the people telling you, hey, I think there's an issue here, are usually not lawyers at headquarters. It's usually someone in the operation who's saying, isn't that building owned by an individual from this sanctioned country, ? So that getting those people engaged and really part of your risk management is going to be critical here as well. Suppliers, I mean, non-EU companies are not going to be in the mindset of this sometimes at all. And I think suppliers are going to be reluctant, especially if they are outside the EU, to engage in this conversation. So lots of complexity here.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for sharing. So see, time is going fast here. So we're going to another poll. And I want to ask the audience. So in your opinion, what is the biggest risk of non-compliance with laws for your organizations? Is it fines and financial penalties? Is it reputational damage? Is it operational disruption or litigation and other legal challenges? And we see the answers coming in. And quite interesting. I see a lot of votes for reputational damage here. Zeke, what do you think?
Yeah, again, I'm not going to lead the viewers. The responses are all intertwined with one another. So, when I was at Yara, we paid a large fine. We also had a great deal of reputational damage and operational disruption. And you see that they all played into each other. However, and I agree with what our audience is coming out with here, the reputational damage is the most significant one, right down to the day-to-day stuff. So you see how it affects employee motivation, for example. I think that's a real difficulty to get the culture back on the right track and everyone pulling in the same good direction again is a real challenge.
Yeah, thank you. So we move on to the next topic, and this is an important one because we have looked at some relevant legislative developments. Can you maybe walk us through some of the recent enforcement actions in the industry, in various industries, and can you maybe discuss some trends?
Yeah. So I think a lot of compliance professionals working in compliance, legal, audit, wherever, would like to spend more time understanding recent cases and what they mean for their business, but we often don't get time to do that with the busy day jobs. So today we've just picked 3 recent enforcement actions. As expected, they come from the US because we see much more enforcement there than other jurisdictions. And those 3 all relate to the commodities trading sector. So we start with Freepoint, which is a $98 million settlement in December of last year, related to Petrobras. If you'd forgotten that name, then shame on you, because it's still making headlines. Then we saw a $661 million settlement against Gunvor in March of this year. And most recently, Trafigura paid $126 million or settled for that amount related to allegations of bribery, again related to Petrobras. All of this comes on top of the Glencore actions that we saw over recent years, but that we're not going into today. A few threads between those cases. As I said, all commodities trading. The alleged misconduct in each case was some time ago and went on for quite a significant number of years. So lots of activities in the past over a longer period of time, which are only becoming relevant now. For Gunvor and Trafigura, there was previous misconduct, and that was something that no doubt factors into the settlement agreements that they've made with the US authorities. But in terms of trends, the usual red flags are what are coming through. You've got public officials, you've got high-risk territories. These three are all in Latin America. You've got Petrobras, the scandal, which has seemingly very, very long tentacles. And then you've got bribes being funneled through commissions, so agents and intermediaries again. However, in these three cases, there are absolutely no monitorships put in place. So that sharpest of weapons that has been used by the authorities over several years, a monitor, which is an independent expert brought in to make sure that the company is responding well to the expectations placed on them. A monitor hasn't been used, and we can only assume that the fraud section believes that they have enough resources to review the detailed reporting coming from the companies.
Yeah, thank you, Zeke. It's interesting, and I want to engage again with our listeners. So another poll for you: which aspect of handling reports require the most improvement in your current reporting system? Is it accessibility and ease of use of the system? Is it timelessness of let's say of the reports? Is it transparency of the investigation process? Is it adequacy of follow-up and feedback to reporters? So Zeke, this is a poll much related to whistleblowing and reporting mechanisms. You've been working with various tools, I think, over the last years. I'm super interested to hear your thoughts here. We see polls coming in.
Yeah, so
interestingly,
it's very keen to watch the results of this one. Again, some interlinks between these, and you see the things like timeliness of the response to reports. That's very prescribed in the EU whistleblowing directive. So I don't know if companies are necessarily struggling with that or need to improve it, but there is a legislative push on the timeliness. Transparency of the investigation process is the one that comes through most clearly, though, and partly that's because it relates so much to the culture. You know, you want to say, look, we have a speak-up culture. We want issues to be out on the table and dealt with right. Yeah. And that doesn't always mean blowing the whistle. That means having an open conversation with your line manager or others, so that the speak-up culture is really important. But when you do have a serious topic, when you do have an investigation, I think it's great if you can show transparency where possible. But we all know that's not entirely possible. So I agree with our viewers here, and there's a huge amount we could discuss about that one.
Yeah, great to have these inputs from the listeners. Thank you for being so active here. So we come basically to the last question before zooming in a little bit on the questions of our audience. Yeah. Can you maybe briefly mention 3 learnings for compliance professionals that they can learn from the cases we just described, Trafigura, Glencore, Petrobras? What is it, what we can give our audiences here as some 3 tips?
Yeah, so I think from these settlements, we've got Freepoint, we've got Gunvor, and we've got Trafigura. They're all very recent, so the reading on this is very relevant to how we deal with problems in larger companies. First of all, you've got self-disclosure. I think getting self-disclosure right, especially the timing of it, which facts are included, is really important. You can save millions of dollars in getting these things right. So self-disclosure is the first one. Yeah. The next one is cooperation. Whether or not you've self-disclosed, the enforcement authorities are highly critical where you don't make documents available, where you don't preserve documents is a particularly heinous offense. But also just making individuals available, for interview and meetings. I think that's really important. So that second one is cooperation. Thirdly, on remediation, the authorities are looking to make sure that you've actually fixed the problems. Noteworthy that Trafigura and several other companies have ended certain intermediary practices, especially on the sales side. I I think the incentives to commit bribery, those sorts of offences, through an intermediary are so strong that these companies have said, look, we don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Really great learning. And especially then just on remediation, think about senior people, think about discipline, because the authorities are looking for that.
Well, thank you. And then I think we move on to some questions from the audience.
Sure.
We have a few minutes left, so I want to pick maybe 2 or 3 of the questions. So we have them in front of us here, Zeke. Maybe I think the first one we already did. So let's go to a question of Rebecca. How is it recommended to overview emerging national legislation in the countries where you are operating in? And how can you stay up to date? Special tools, use the compliance network. Right. I think I already asked you, it's super difficult in an ever-changing legal landscape to identify all relevant legislations for your business. Great question, Rebecca. Zeke, what is your vision here?
It's a fantastic question. We can have in mind at a central level, usually at the headquarters of a larger company, you can have in mind a couple of bits of legislation or an overall approach to the legislation that would satisfy most of the national requirements. But you can't be an expert everywhere. I think there are some of the larger law firms who offer really great databases that are kept up to speed on what's going on in each country. Some of those are free resources, and other times you do need to get someone in to talk to you about them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think tip from my side is that create a sort of mind map for yourself as being end responsible legally for a business, where you have your biggest risks and compliancy matters displayed. It's basically a one-pager with the most relevant legislations, and I think that is a great starting point as well. And we also go to another question, and that's a question from Sarah. So what are the most important things to consider before opening whistleblower channels that can be used by third parties as suppliers, customers? So it's an interesting one. We've seen over the last years that actually a lot of organizations already are opening, let's say, their whistleblowing mechanism also for their supply chains. Do you have some tips and tricks here for Sarah?
Yeah. So again, a wonderful question. If we just take the basics first, operating a whistleblowing channel is not really a question of would I like to anymore. It's in the legislation, but it is also the best way of uncovering misconduct of any type. I mean, if you read something like the ACFE report to the nations on fraud, that report will tell you that the best way of uncovering frauds is through tips. So it's not a choice to have these channels in place. Is it a choice to open it up to external parties or not? I don't think so. I think you're going to get the broadest possible church by opening it up to everyone, and that includes the external parties. Now, if an external party happens to be a supplier who observes something they don't like on the ground, just like we talked about with the CS3D, that's going to be a rich source of data. I would highly encourage those channels to be opened up to third parties. Things to be careful of. The scope. Make sure that they are able to report, and it's clear in your instructions to them, they're able to report on certain things, and in some jurisdictions, they're not able to report on other things. So you need to make that scope clear in individual countries. In some places, financial misconduct, fraud, personal data would have to be handled in a very different way. So be really careful on the scope that you're giving to external parties. And I think begin to manage expectations and what can and cannot be dealt with. The channel's got to be open, but it's not necessarily going to fix every problem under the sun. Yeah.
Maybe we are going to look at last questions. We actually have a lot of questions, so do not worry. We have seen those questions, and if we do not have time to answer your questions in the last minute now, then we will come back to you on these questions after the webinar. So I think a last question we have from Chris, and that is a question: how would you see the whistleblower domain evolve over the next few years? It's a broad question. Zeke, can you maybe try to provide a short answer here?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. So whistleblowing will cover more topics. I think that's a first point.
Yeah.
As technology and businesses themselves evolve, as the expectations on things like the supply chain evolve, the content of the reports made to the whistleblowing channels are going to be much more broad. So that's the first change I would see. We don't yet know what the effect of artificial intelligence would be here. I think we can have some ideas on what that might be. The level of automation, for example, is interesting. The level to which we can analyze a report very, very quickly is interesting. But I don't think that's going to settle for quite a while. Yeah. I think we're still responding to what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah. And maybe I think to add here, apart from the ever-changing, let's say, the fast technology when it comes to AI, that will definitely have an impact. But I also foresee that transparency around whistleblowing will increase. We have seen that after the GDPR with the privacy laws, everybody had like privacy laws high on the agenda. The same we will see with whistleblowing. It will be a topic that will be high on the agendas. And I think with social media being more and more present in daily lives, we will also see an increased transparency among the workforce. So I will expect, and that's what we see in our data, is that the amount of reports goes up every year. So Chris, that's also, I think, something to be aware of. So, well, it looks if we have reached the end of this webinar. And of course, I want to thank you, Zeke, for flying all the way to Amsterdam, to our studio, and helping everyone to understand how to stay ahead and also proactive to all those legislative changes.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And also thank you, dear listeners, for attending. We are very interested also to hear your opinion about today's discussion. So we will share a feedback form with you. Please fill it in. It will really help us to provide you with even better content next time. And we will also share the recordings with you, so you can have a look at it again or share it with your colleagues. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.